right, Ethan, just on the off chance that any of our listeners actually care about our lives, give us a quick update on colleges. What have you gotten into? Who's giving you money? All the things.
Okay, so I have like 4 colleges that are my top, I guess you could say, that are hopefully the most likely. I'm still waiting on 2 of them to get back, and the ones that I would go to if I got into all of them. So those colleges are UNC Chapel Hill, Hillsdale, Dartmouth, and Boston College. I'm waiting on Dartmouth and Boston College because they get more applications, regular decision, they take longer. Dartmouth moved their deadline up to April 9th, I think, for telling you if you got in or not. And it's usually the end of March on Ivy Day, where it always is.
There's an Ivy Day?
There's an Ivy Day where all the Ivies release decision on the same day. Shield told me. I had no idea, but I guess Dartmouth is not doing Ivy Day now. I did get into Hillsdale and UNC, and they both gave good offers. I'm going to Washington, D.C. to compete for some more scholarship money for Hillsdale in a couple weeks. And Chapel Hill gave me like an irresistible offer that I'm pretty much going to have to take. And I'm happy with it too. So happy with that. Good stuff happening on the college front.
Fantastic. Well, you're absolutely right about it being a difficult year for applications. I've lost track of how many colleges have sent me. They all have to, it's like they must all like talk to each other, or it's just that bad. Like,
yeah,
I don't get these emails from like non-prestigious schools. Like nobody's safety schools have emailed me, but all of the reach schools have emailed me with an insanely high percentage of increased applications this year, and a increasingly diverse applicant field. And they've actually done way more early decision application acceptances than they normally do, at least for some schools. So it's definitely a weird year. Now, of course, that's not what we're here to talk about today, but let's get on to our actual resolution, because, of course, here on What's the Res, we are all about the current conversation about the resolutions in the world of high school debate. Ethan, what's the Res?
The Res is the United States ought to guarantee universal child care.
And what an interesting resolution. What are your initial thoughts on this resolution?
Who thought of this, essentially, is my first thought. I mean, clearly there's some board of directors or whatever that had input, people voted it, and I mean, my first thought is, if I had a kid, where would I want to leave him or her while I'm not there? And my first thought is not the government. So that's kind of where my mind initially goes. But then I actually ended up talking with someone about it and got a little more nuanced of a perspective. But first, like, raw impression was, yeah, I'm not leaving my kid at the DMV.
I think that's a good initial thought. I mean, honestly, that's government employees are, in some ways, they're necessary, because a bureaucracy is a useful tool to get a large number of functional things done. I mean, the DMV at a baseline is functional. It does handle car registrations. It does handle ticket processing and the random things they do. It doesn't do it particularly well.
Now, let me tell you a little story about the DMV, because I just went there. I have been trying to get my adult. Okay, so look, I don't even have my after 9s, and I'm over 18. So I'm like over a year, 2 years late on this, right? And COVID has had a massive impact on that. The meetings, you need to schedule a meeting with the DMV like a month and a half in advance. They kicked me out because I didn't have some form last time. And let me tell you, like, it's hard for me to be in the DMV, let alone like an infant or like a little kid. Like, it smells like COVID in there. It looks like COVID in there. Like, it reeks. It's just full. It's like a cesspool of humanity, I guess you could say. Like, and it's just nasty. Like, nobody's happy. Everybody's grumpy. Everybody's greasy. Like, they clearly took a half day on work for this, and you know you're still not going to get what you want. So,
where was all of this last year when I wanted you to write a satirical short story in literature class?
Because that's already the DMV satire has already been done in Zootopia with the sloth.
I know.
So I can't copy that.
So good. No, but you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the DMV is a standard trope across, I think, most states. Honestly, though, North Carolina is way better than Virginia. The Virginia DMV is fully government run. North Carolina, I was shocked to learn when I moved here, is actually they outsource most DMV functions to a private company.
What? No way. I didn't know that. Get me one of those.
For as bad as it is, it's better than it is in other states.
And you're right about the fact that it does work. It might take a while. It might take longer. You might need to come back a few times and reprint a couple things, but it does get the job done. So give it that.
The question there that I think you've raised in a really good way is that what we want for the smallest of children? Do we want something that works? And that really is at the heart of this resolution. Wait, my initial thought was I went straight to one of my favorite episodes of The Office, where Jim and Pam, the classic romantic couple of The Office, they've gotten married. Pam is pregnant with their first kid, and they're going to interview at a prestigious daycare. And I don't have kids. I've not done this, but I've talked to friends who do. This is a thing where parents will they'll identify the good daycare and the good preschool. And in some places, parents will they'll map out this daycare, this preschool, this Ivy League-esque elementary school pipeline thing. Oh, man. It gets crazy. But parents want good daycare. And for Jim and Pam on that episode, it was really a necessity because they needed they're a two-income family, like a lot of families in the United States today. And of course, in the episode, the joke of the episode is that Jim walks in on the guy that they're going to interview with in the bathroom, and it's super awkward. And eventually, he denies their interview goes so badly that they don't go to that daycare. But the next couple episodes, they follow this story arc where Pam is home with the baby, and eventually she's using her maternity leave. But when her maternity leave is up, she has to go back to work because either she loses her job and they lose their income, or she's going to stay home with the kids. And it kind of frames, I think, the classic issue that a lot of parents are caught in, where you've set your expenses up in such a way that you need two incomes to meet expenses and live a certain lifestyle. And the question is, well, now that we've got kids, does someone stay home with the kids, typically the mom? Does mom stay home with the kids, or do we do daycare? And at that point, how do we pay for daycare becomes a big question.
Right. So I guess in order sort of to frame that whole example into an essential question for the round is the need that universal child care would fill enough of a need to justify making it a government program?
Yeah.
Or I guess you could even put it, is it enough of a need for it to just work and not be the premium prestige daycare that you would see in the example? And that's a question that covers, pretty much every debate topic we have, even especially public forum debate topics. We just had the one, not just, but about, Medicare for all. We had a little while ago.
Mm-hmm. A couple cycles back before West African urbanization.
Right, yeah. Is the problem we're aiming to, or that we're targeting, large enough of a problem so that we need a solution that works, even if it's not perfect, and a universal solution at that?
Yeah, I think that's key here, because we are not talking about just a single state-by-state plan. We are talking about a universal child care program. So whatever affirmative ends up arguing, they've got to deal with that word universal. Now, I think one of the other things that we got to deal with too on definitions is how old are we talking about here when we talk about universal child care? I mean, are we talking about after infants are weaned through preschool, or are we talking through kindergarten? How does this exactly work? And I'm assuming that we're not going to carry this through and say, aha, this is actually guaranteeing childcare through age 18, but instead this would kind of be basically covering that gap between infancy to when kindergarten through 12th grade public education kicks in.
I can see someone finding a card about a psychological study done where there's a certain age cutoff for when a kid can kind of do X, Y, and Z by themselves and doesn't need their biological mother or a mother figure there to sort of attend to them at all times. I can see that someone just finding that standard card, everybody adopting it, and that kind of being the solid definition, But, I mean, I think this question is still valid, regardless as to whether or not someone finds a specific card to define it by. I mean, there's going to be plenty of psychological arguments to be made about what are the benefits of having a child stay with its mother for this amount of time. Would it be a better thing for society if kids stayed with their mothers until they were this age and were not in daycare? But there's plenty of arguments to be made on the other side about accessibility to daycare and putting people to work, things like that.
Well, now, Ethan, talk to me about your initial thoughts on that word guarantee. What all is implied or covered in the idea of guaranteeing this universal child care?
Definitely paid for taxpayer dollars. It's a federal program, or I'm assuming it's a federal program. It's universal child care. It could, I guess in a nuanced sense, it could take place kind of like your DMV example where we're outsourcing through private institutions, but I wouldn't see how that would affect anything on the financial side of things because we're still funding it in the same way, though maybe logistically speaking, you could have some benefits in a plan-oriented kind of sense there. And we're talking about federal standards for training, licensing, and all the whole 9 yards, right? It's kind of like my first thought when I talked about this with someone else was the Food and Drug Administration standards for like how much of this substance could be in this, packaged item, nutrition facts, like all of those different labels. Now we're going to have an entire new list of standards for who can be allowed to operate or have a job at a daycare, and who are we going to let the kids around? Like, what's the age cutoff? What's the background check, sort of thing?
Which, in a very real sense, really, there's going to be, if that happens, there's going to be a massive jobs impact. Because I'm thinking of there's a lot of people who will work in daycare and early childcare. That's a less regulated area right now. For decades, I have an aunt who worked in a daycare center in northern Alabama, and I cannot imagine that she has a particular license or certification. What she has is experience being a mom, and then working in a church Sunday school nursery for years, and then joining in a town daycare center. And she's great at taking care of small kids. There's no problem there. She's got like 6 grandkids of her own. It's not like there's a lack of real qualification. But once you put this official government seal of approval on it that typically is accompanied by everything you're describing, licensure, certification, safety standards, and so on, there is no way that my aunt would go through all of the stuff that would then be required if this was going to happen. And I think she's relatively normal for the kinds of folks who work those sort of jobs.
It could be. And then there's more like corporate sort of daycares almost. Like I know there's this one name called Right Time where they'll hire like kids. I mean, not kids, but like 20s, 30s, and whatever. And they just kind of hang out and turn the TV on and whatever, and give someone an Xbox controller if they can't turn on Minecraft or whatever. Like I've been to daycares when I was younger. This is what it was like. Like, I mean, they would throw a movie on. If someone wanted to climb the rock wall instead, they just got to make sure no one busts their head. And like, it was fun though. Like it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed going to those places. But again, the idealism, pragmatism sort of idea. But I don't want to skip over the licensure and training too quickly, because it begs the question, is this an area where you need to remove the incentive for profit? And the parallel that sort of immediately comes into my mind is private prisons, or the whole argument about how we need to only have federal prisons because there's no incentive for profit, so we're feeding them the correct amounts, we're taking extra measures to make sure basic levels of nutrition are met, and that you're not just like shutting off the power in cells to save money and people are starving and freezing and all that sort of thing, right? So could you sort of use that logic in parallel in the childcare sense? I mean, maybe it's necessary to have certain licenses, maybe it's necessary to have certain like standards that people have to meet, so that a private corporation wouldn't just hire someone off the street with no age restriction as long as they're a person that can work hours and get the job done. Maybe removing the incentive for profit could get the job done better in this sense and make it accessible to everybody.
Which, of course, goes to the flip side as well, where you could argue, and I'm sure there are people who make this argument for private prisons. I think it definitely applies here, where you could argue that in reality, what would actually lead to the implementation of those higher standards is the profit motivation. That your higher quality daycare centers are going to be the ones that offer a product that the market will bear and that parents want. Because parents want the best for their kids. And parents are going to pull their kids out of a shoddy daycare center if they have the ability to. Which might be an argument as well for saying, here's why we need a baseline for here is the minimum of care, and then the market ticks up and says, okay, if you want better care, we'll provide that at a private daycare center. Kind of like the public school, private school stereotypical argument goes.
Right, and then a lot of some issues that come in with that is clearly the affordability of it, because if you can have the same thing with mandated standards and federally enforced standards that's free, clearly it's the preferable option. Again, whether or not we could achieve that is the question. And then I also see an opportunity for a perm on the negative, where you could say, okay, clearly there's problems with profit and private daycare centers, and the drive for greed and profit and whatever is making daycares worse. So we implement federal mandates and impose them upon private daycare centers so that we can reap the benefits of better standards, but also have private corporations. I mean, I can see someone trying it, but you could try that with any argument about private public sort of thing. But again, it's another option that's still out there that fits the framework. So I can see someone using it.
It's true, but I don't see that being like the big direction this round is
No,
going to go in.
not even close.
I mean,
I could see that as a desperate move in like the.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's really gonna derail the debate if somebody goes in that direction. It suddenly establishes that it becomes a debate about big government versus small, tailored government policy, and whether the market actually responds in the way that big government proponents think it does. I think the big issue of this round is actually going to be feminism on both sides. I see a strong feminist argument on both sides of this debate. Where I think this argument is really an extension of the feminist movement insisting that women have the right to work. And if women do have the right to work, does that right then extend to a guaranteed right to work even when you now have new responsibilities of a child to take care of? So if you have a right to work, but you've given birth to a child, does society then have an obligation to enable you to continue working while your child is young enough to need that kind of care? So I think the obvious problem here that occurs is that if mothers have to care for their children during the day, then they are not in the workforce. So on affirmative, I think there's a clear feminist argument arguing that because we as a society affirm the right of women to work, we are also affirming the right for them to have childcare so that they are able to work. That right carries an enablement to work as kind of an implication. But then on neg, I think there's an easy flip of the argument to say that we are so overvaluing the participation of women in the workforce that we are devaluing the unique value that mothers give in the process of raising children. And we are systemically setting up society to require a two-income family that means that mothers are not properly valued. And so it's sort of going down a more second-wave feminism rather than third-wave feminism, if you're familiar with the distinction between those two schools of thought.
I can sort of discern the degrees of radicalness, but I don't know the principles of each individual wave. But
for a very brief primer,
yes, please.
Since your feminism is kind of usually described in these three waves, and we're currently in the middle of a fourth, where the initial feminism is sort of a feminism of legal rights. Think of that as the votes for women kind of era. And I'm vastly simplifying an enormously complex body of literature and arguments. Second wave feminism is a feminism of really equality in terms of property ownership, equal access in the workplace. Third wave feminism is the much more radical feminism of the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s, where it's sort of to put it in rather crass terms, a sense of like, well, we were oppressed, so now women are going to oppress men in turn. And sort of we're going to flip the paradigm completely. Where we currently are in terms of feminist discourse, as far as I've kind of followed current discussions, is sort of trying to, there are plenty of authors who want to carry the feminist movement all the way in a more radical direction. There's also people who are attempting to kind of rescue a sense of like, well, we agree that women have not had full and equal treatment, and we want full and equal treatment, but we also don't want to get rid of the unique things that only women can do, and we think that valuing that is important. So there's sort of this current attempt to define how exactly does that go, and the question of work is key to that, because there was a moment in the middle of the feminist movement of the 70s and 80s and 90s where there was this kind of message proclaimed in the way that societal messages are sort of just absorbed and proclaimed.
Yeah, totally.
That women can have it all. You can be a mother, you can be a wife, you can also be an executive, and you can have it all. And the question currently is like, well, is that actually true? And I think this resolution brings that question to the forefront. Is it true that you can move in all these ways that are taking a woman out of the home and say that you can't have it all? Or is it rather the case that we need to look back and say, perhaps it's actually not the case, that the obligations of motherhood should outweigh the right to be in the workforce and so on. It's hard to say all of this without already sounding offensive. And
No. I appreciate the neutrality that you attempted to give that, and I think that you did give that. And I don't know if all of our listeners agree, but I know you've read literature on this, so I appreciate the overview for sure. I think that's fair. No, feminism is going to be the key issue in this debate for 100% sure. This is going to be. It's just such a deep I mean, which is perfect for Lincoln Douglas. Like, I mean,
so good.
It's great for Lincoln Douglas. Like, it just begs a question about responsibility, essentially. Like, if you, which in essence, like, should the choice to have a child within a marriage be sort of compensated for on a societal level by providing equal opportunity to work with daycare or through daycare if not provided through any other means? I mean,
I'm just going to point out that you located that within a marriage. You've also got to consider the fact that are we then asserting that this child has to be inside a marriage, or is this also, are we going to say that, well, no, you don't have to be married to participate in universal child care?
You can't. Well, I mean,
if you have
universal, yeah. So again, that wouldn't even work. Like, is it the government's responsibility to take care of the children under the potential assumption that a woman wants to go back to work, or in the other sense, like, have to take care of a child because they have to take care of a child, regardless of whatever motivation?
So
I'll let the debaters handle that one.
It's also this is another place where I think, and I see this more frequently in congressional debate than I do in LD or PF, but this is going to be one of the places where teenagers are going to be discussing a lot of things that they don't, that presumably have not yet themselves experienced. They're going to be talking about all of these groups of people who have had children and want to go into the workforce or don't want to go in the workforce, and yet they themselves are not parents and are not actively able to be parents yet. All of those things are also in play. So it's going to make this kind of an interesting discussion, to say the least. Okay. Well, I at least had some thoughts on values if debaters are thinking a traditional debate case structure. So I think on AF, the two values that leapt to my mind were equality and probably economic fairness, something like that. You're looking for sort of a Rawlsian justice as fairness sort of criterion or approach there. And your thoughts on AF values?
I'm peaking. I already see util on neg, and I think that's a perfectly viable value on affirmative for this one too, just because, oddly enough, like, the economic argument is sort of in the hands of the affirmative as well, in the sense that you're putting more people to work, so which there's plenty of links that you can draw to a growing economy and a booming economy from more people being at work. So I think that affirmative has a unique access to util on this resolution, more so than it does in others.
Okay. Because I would see on neg there, my initial one that I would run to if I were writing this case would be human dignity, and wanting to look at the unique dignity of mothers in particular. And I actually, we'll get to this more in a moment, but I want to run a neg K on this resolution.
Why?
I want to run a K that asserts that the prior harm that the resolution is asserting is the benefit of a two-income family, and that we need to structure society to, and if we do put in place universal child care, we are actually normalizing the two-income family that is the current status quo. And we are creating a society that is no longer able to even raise the question, should both parents work? Instead, we're saying, we're going to assume that you both want to work, and that your work in the marketplace as a lawyer, a doctor, a paralegal, a teacher, a principal, whatever, is of greater social value than the work that you would provide in creating a home and raising your own child.
That's great. That's a great assumption, and then you can also plug in the assumption that not only are you assuming that you should work, but you're assuming that others should bear the consequences of you gaining that ability on a societal level,
they should pay for it.
Yeah, you're assuming that you, as well as everybody else in society, should contribute to your right to work.
Yeah,
is another key assumption.
I think so, and that both of those assumptions then create the initial harm that I'm going to say that's going to kick this debate into an a priori space where we need to actually go back and we need to debate the positives and negatives of a two-income society rather than now. To actually make that work would require somebody who's much better at case strategy than I am. I don't know. That's my initial impulse, and I would ground that in the human dignity argument. I would see the neg ground on util really being kind of looking at the fact that then looking at a totally different direction. We can't fund this, we can't implement this, and we're actually going to cause all kinds of psychological harms. There's actually a ton of data if you compare children who are in daycare Now there's, we'll get to some of this. I grabbed a couple of quotes to support this, but there's some really interesting studies that have been done on this where the AF can cite certain studies claiming that daycare leads to certain increases in academic performance that lead to decrease in crime, but there's other articles claiming those studies are actually fraudulent and are ignoring the mental health harms of children who grow up in a daycare center more than they grow up in an actual home. And kind of looking at that and saying, actually, there's severe mental health harms here. So I think you could also look at a util case on feasibility and long-term mental health harms of universal child care as opposed to being raised by a family that has structured itself to take care of children.
Oh man, I think negative is going to need to be a little not even tricky on this one, but negative, you're going to need to have your hand around affirmative's throat on this one for this particular reason, is that the United States ought to guarantee universal child care. That's a choice. That's exactly like when Joe Biden got up on stage and said Medicare for all who want it, right? It's a total scapegoat. Not anything against, Biden's Medicare proposal, or medical proposal. But again, do not let affirmative have the loophole that this is a choice, so therefore more people are feeding into the program than people will reap from it, so therefore it works. And it's just a perfect opt-in, opt-out system that anybody can have and anybody cannot have. You can have a 2-income family, you can have a 1-income family, a mom stays home and whatever. That's not going to fly. On negative, I don't think it's an implausible position to take to assume that all daycare is bad and to negate the resolution, right? Because if you're running psychological arguments, you're not just saying, you're making the proposal, right, that time that children spend with mothers is critical, right? So that applies to private daycare. It doesn't matter what type of daycare you're paying for, not paying for, private, public. That applies to every type of daycare. And if you're going to go fully on a psychological case and run util, there's a lot of kids, right? So you can grab the majority in that, and there's kind of the idea that everybody that's a kid grows up to be an adult at some point. So this is going to affect everybody if this is a universal sort of standard that we're holding society to. So you don't sound like an oppressive patriarch on the negative side. Don't make it about who gets to go to work and who doesn't go to work. Make it about the future generation. Make it about the kids. Make it about how are you going to properly steward the mind, the mental health of that child so that they don't grow up to be, a criminal or, a disadvantaged person in society, so that we can solve for certain issues at the level, at the age level of a child. Make this about the kids on neg so you don't sound like a jerk.
Well, and I think, honestly, that's a great word to think about how this sounds, because, I'm sure people have already started writing feminist, femk alternative cases on AF.
Yeah.
Just ready for neg to kind of sound like a supporter of the inherent patriarchy, and then bring a feminist onslaught on AF. That's probably right. So, but focusing on the kids shifts that focus a lot. I like that.
And does it matter that half the kids are female, anyways? Because those are still girls that are harmed, right? And then if you find some study about how children in daycare, what do they look like, 15 years from then, right? No, this is legitimate. Do they have the same college acceptances, levels of education, SAT scores? There's studies for all of this stuff. Not that I've found it, but I know it's out there. So are you harming future generations of men and women? But if you really want to focus on the feminist side, that you can hone in on the women's part, right? And maybe we see some of these issues later in life stemming from a potential link to time spent with mothers. That's much less of a link, but I still think that the feminist umbrella can't really there's still female children, right?
Well, that's true. I'm just the times I have attempted to debate more feminist leaning friends than it's really hard once they paint you with a patriarchal brush to combat that. So
make it about the kids.
I think right? So, but if you're making about the kids, I would try to shift the argument away from gendered argumentation at all.
Sorry, so not kids, mental health of children.
Yeah. The kids, but not focusing on boy kids, girl kids. That's shifting away from that.
You don't want to play the game.
Exactly.
You don't want to play the apps game on the neg. Neg, you're going to be playing your own game. You're going to need a tight grip, because the fact that this is a opt-in, opt-out type of thing, it's not Medicare for all. It's not a universal, everybody does this, everybody does that. This is voluntary, which sucks for the negative. That's not fun at all.
Honestly, on a But it does, you're sending my thoughts in a different direction. If you've already set up the util case, you could take all of these standard arguments against existent welfare programs that we already cannot afford.
Yeah.
And extend those arguments against a new massive social welfare plan. Already we cannot. We're already going to be insolvent on Social Security, on Medicare as it stands, also Medicaid. We can't pay for any of these things for the next 20 years. We definitely can't also pay for a universal child care program. So if you want to take a strict economic route on neg, you could, but you definitely don't have any of the pathos that AF is going to have.
Well, here's nobody cares. Like that's
it's so true.
Like nobody.
I know.
That's just not real anymore, man. Like,
it's real,
no,
but
it's not.
we're
like,
probably still going to get
world.
stimulus checks in a couple months.
But
when
that's the argument just
to
against affordability isn't even a thing anymore in debate. Like it's just whatever. It's dead. Affordability is dead. Make it a hashtag.
On that very exciting
affordability
note,
is dead, and we have killed it.
Thank you, Proto Nietzsche. All right. So what we could also, I honestly, if you don't like traditional LD, I'm going to suggest that you could easily do a one-man policy approach. This is an easy plan advantage or plan or counterplan and disadvantage type case. We are talking about a policy, and there are 4 different legislative models currently in existence. Google them. The easiest one the first one I found was Elizabeth Warren's plan. There are several others, and there are also the Manhattan Institute and Brookings Institute both have analysis of the existing plans. It's not hard to research those, and then it becomes, if you take that kind of approach, it becomes more a matter of how do you use your cards and your research and respond. Crafting the case is not going to be the difficult part there, I don't think.
No. Good stuff on both sides. Yeah, I agree with you completely.
Okay. Well, I propose, as we're kind of looking at the remainder of our time on this episode, I'm going to give initial thoughts on AF, and then I want to hear your response.
Okay.
And I'll do the same thing on NEG. And then we've got a couple of closing thoughts, and we'll suggest some articles and wrap this thing up. On AF, I think part of this initially, it's worth noting that the AF world does solve a felt need. We do live in a status quo economy where the two-income families face immediate economic disruption with the arrival of a child. Children are expensive and they require care. There is a personal felt desire to care for your own child. There is the moral obligation to care for your own child. And there is the economic necessity of, like, this kid is expensive. In the first 6 months of a child's life, we're talking about nearly 24-hour care. So that's expensive. The status quo, it is for most levels of income, and I'm just going to use the ones that I'm most familiar with in the teaching world. If you're a teacher, your salary is almost equal to what it costs to put a kid in daycare for 50 weeks of the year, 5 days a week. So in all honesty, in a two-income family, typically the wife has a choice. She's going to basically break even if she stays home. And if they go with the daycare route, in most cases, and this varies depending on cost of living, it's going to cost her entire salary for them to go the daycare route. So what that means then is this brings in the women's equality part, that there's a strong case to be made that this is an issue of women's equality, that this makes women equal to men in terms of being able to work full time. And if we are really committed to female equality in the workforce, then this is a natural consequence of that. Now, this also has a strong, I think, single mother impact, that where this enables a single working mom to continue working without worrying about the loss of her sole source of income, if that's her situation. So you've got all kinds of kind of impact directions you could take that in. Ethan, what are your thoughts on all that?
No, that's like that argument is, I mean, just pure fire on the affirmative side. Like the negative's going to have a hard time dealing with that without sounding bad. I mean, and really having to contend with evidence regarding, maternity leave. Like there's I mean, this is the type of thing where you like reach for Denmark and Sweden and whatever, like, right? I mean, this no, seriously, like where other countries have done it better. There's examples. I mean, what would it be like if you had X amount of maternity leave with X amount of pay and, you know, for this long, and it's going to get into all of that. This is the meat of the debate right here. So solid on affirmative.
Now, and there is, of course, I'm reading that as a pretty darn conservative person. If you've been listening to our podcast at all, that's not going to be news. I'm assuming this is a women's rights issue. I'm sure you could take some of those same example countries you just mentioned. They're also the front runners in paternity leave. So you could also look at, I mean, I'm sure there are examples of a two-income family where it actually makes more sense for the father to be home, and where you could kind of flip the gender ratios on that as well.
Yeah, there's going to be some fun to be had with this one for sure.
On neg, my mind initially goes to the harms that we've already talked about of government employees working with the smallest children. How do you deal with, I mean, if you're willing to go there in terms of argumentation and research, I am confident you can find all kinds of data about government employees molesting small children. So how do you prevent that? So that becomes an initial question. Implementability becomes a huge concern. We're talking about hiring personnel. We're talking about building care centers. We're talking about paying for this program. There's all kinds of ways this can be done. Are we talking about building something from scratch? Are we talking about partnering with existing programs? In which case, how do you guarantee the universality part of this? That becomes really tricky. I've already talked about my thoughts on devaluing the role of mothers in forming their own children. That I really think that is there's a huge argument to be made there. Particularly, female debaters will probably find that argument sticks a little bit better than male debaters making an argument about motherhood. I suspect. I don't know. Yeah. Do you think is that a fair observation?
I think like internal biases will say like this person sounds more legitimate if they're a woman talking about motherhood, but I mean, if you got a good solid judge, you can get past it.
Right. Well. And again, warrants. Evidence is everything. Still on neg, it does seem to me that we are moving closer and closer to Plato's Republic. I'm doing a class this semester that's required us to reread sections of the Republic. Plato imagined 2,400 years ago a perfect society with perfect justice, and he started with abolishing the family because it's in the family that you learn private property habits. Instead, in the perfect republic, you learn that everything is everyone's, and the way that you abolish private property is you abolish the family and you have children raised in creches. You get rid of private marriage and everyone belongs to everyone, and the children are the children of the state. The resolution here
everyone
is moving.
Belongs to everyone.
Oh yeah, man, sharing is caring in Plato's Republic.
All right.
This is all worked out in detail in Joe Walton's novels. If anybody wants to read about the one philosopher's novel imagination of how the Republic would work. But in this case, what you're really doing is you are taking the children out of the home and you are encouraging parents to surrender their children to government employees who are going to be espousing whatever government values they are required to espouse, and training these children not to be their own individual private citizens, but rather the government will always take care of you. So there is a strong libertarian argument against this, which, as you already pointed out, can be equally extended into other existing government problems. Yeah. Like, I first ran across this argument from Dr. Michael Watson of Calvin University. This is one of his arguments against government-funded, or against school lunches, actually, and school breakfast in public school, because he thinks school breakfasts teach children that the government will always feed you. Rather, he wants children to learn that you get food by working, and if you work, then you will eat, and that eating is a matter of private productivity rather than the state.
We need more of those people.
We do,
but
our social security programs would also be more solvent if we had more of those people. Okay, this is also the opposite of European moves to establish paid family leave structures. Instead of where some of those same countries you mentioned are all about, they'll just pay mothers for 2 years to stay home and raise their children in those critical years. So I think there could be a very interesting alternative. Instead of private daycare or instead of publicly funded daycare, why don't we commit to paying women's salaries at their current level of employment while they stay home with children?
Oh, that's the best thing ever, right? That's like if I was negative and came up and said, if I was AF and Neg came to me with that, it's like, let's just pay women their full salary and they get to stay home. It's like, you're in danger now. Like, I would hate to be that AF. But no, is that?
I think it's a viable option. There, oddly enough, this is a related side note, I promise. I think it's Poland. It's one of the Eastern European countries that has had a really sharp population decline. It might be Lithuania, it might be Hungary. It's one of those kind of small Eastern European countries. They have recently put in place a program whereby if you have a child, they will pay you like several $1,000s per kid. They want to incentivize the creation of more children because if their population decline continues, they won't have a sustainable economy in 50 years. So the way to reverse that is to incentivize more kids. This kind of structure where you're like, okay, we're going to societally enable you to have a family and raise children actually structurally supports that kind of life, as opposed to structurally supporting having fewer children because it's economically difficult and incentivizing more participation in the workforce rather than creation of the home and nurturing of the family.
Yes, completely. So, and I think to sort of tweak something from the first half of that specifically, I think Neg is a lot more powerful thinking about what we would be missing out on by implementing this program versus what harms would come once we implement this program. Simply because a lot of the harms that would come with the implementation of a universal child care program would be economic. Those are tired arguments. Nonetheless, they're legitimate, and I think that's the legit reason why this wouldn't work. As
a judge who's heard all of those a lot, I agree with calling those tired arguments.
Yes, they're definitely well spent. They're completely legitimate, and I think that if, in all practicality, universal childcare would not work because we can't afford it, or it wouldn't work for a long period of time because we can't afford it. I guess is a better way to put that. But I think for the sake of novelty and debate and actually making a good case for motherhood, essentially, focus on what we would be missing out if we implemented this program is less. Don't say that more women we would be missing out on less women working. I guess, which sounds terrible, and that's just a weird way of putting it.
Yep.
Focus on we would be missing out on the mother-child relationship in a large and universal sort of sense. And I think that focusing on that side of things avoids the type of rebuttals you would get, like harms of government employees working with the smallest children. And you talked about how we could find plenty of examples of government employees molesting children. Like, you could find examples of anybody molesting children. Like, I mean...
Yep.
Focus on the motherhood.
I think
focus on the psychological. Oh, there's just so much of it. Like, the psych arguments always suck, but here they won't. They just won't. They're going to be so good.
There's a lot that we could do with this particular argument. I mean, there's some great stuff on the table. All right, Ethan, I feel like we've said most of what we've really brought to this episode. Any final thoughts or suggestions for people prepping this one?
No, I just I think that this is just such a fun one. Like, this is such a good resolution because affirmative has good access to economic arguments, which isn't always the case because, yes, it may cost a lot, but you're putting more people to work, so maybe we can compensate with that. And negative has access to the psychological arguments, which
almost never happens on neg and PF or LD.
Yes, it almost never happens on neg, and when it happens on AF, it's like minuscule. Like, no one cares. Like, yeah, get a therapist. But here, I mean... it's real. Like, it's like childcare and federally, funded childcare. So I think neg has a lot of fun access to some unique arguments that you won't see again for a long time. And affirmative has a good economic and equality angle, which don't always mix well, but here it might just. So a great resolution. A ton of fun to be had with this one for sure.
Well, props to the NSDA LD Wording Committee. We've had a lot of fun talking about this over the last 45 minutes or so. I guess my last thoughts to folks are just encouragement. This has been one heck of a year for speech and debate, and this cycle across March and April will be nationwide. This will be going out to districts and people will be qualifying to go to nationals. This will be the last big resolution before we get the one that we'll have May and June to prep for. So good luck, everybody. I think, as hopefully we've shown on this episode, there's a lot of fun to be had. And there are, for once, the conservative side has some good arguments that you don't have to sound like a crazy, fundy person who's ready to blow up the world in order to make a conservative argument. But there's also some great arguments on the progressive side. So there's really good argumentation to be had really all across the board here. So we hope that you've enjoyed listening to this episode. And we'd love to get some feedback from you. Ethan, how can people leave us feedback if they want to let us know what they think?
If you want to leave us feedback and let us know, you can email us at whatsttheres@gmail.com. That's WHATSTHERES@gmail.com. Check out our website, www.whatsttheres.com, and follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit at whatsttheres_. And until next time, work hard, speak well, and seek the truth.